Hello everyone, it's Wednesday instead of Thursday, so our change date today, unfortunately, well not unfortunately, it's because most of you wanted tomorrow off instead of homework. So, hello everyone from wherever you all are. What have we got? We got quite a few people in Canada today, which is new. We got Germany. We've still got the people down under. Alan's still on, I think. What else have we got? Bruce just come back from Yellowstone. Slightly jealous about that. So there we go. We all have our sacrifices to make. So let's get started today. So we've got an hour's worth of editing as normal today. In that hour, we're going to go through version 21, which is the current version of Capture One that everyone who now buys a copy of Capture One will be using. If you don't have a copy of Capture One and you want to buy one, then use the free trial option that they've got for a start, because that'll actually get you access to it for 30 days for free. For those of you that do have Capture One and you are on version 21, then great. Make sure you're running version 21.0.1, which is the latest version. There are a couple of questions on there about has there been a new update? I know a couple of you have got a couple of maybe video glitches, and there are some questions about the Nikon Z6 II and Z7 II and stuff like that. I know it's in the works. I know there will be a new version that's coming out. I don't know exactly when, but it is on the radar. For those of you still using version 20, most of what we're going to go through today you can still use and follow along in 99.9% of cases, but do make sure there was the last version, I believe it's the last version, of Capture 120 released the other day. So that's an update, which is the version is 13.1.4, which is effectively 20.1.4. That version also gives you Big Sur compatibility for Mac users and Windows 10, I think it's 20H2 from memory. For Windows users, but there's also a couple of bug fixes in there too. So just be aware, all of you, so whether you're a new user to Capture One and using the trial, or a current version 20 user, or a current version 21 user, please do keep an eye on support.captureone.com. On there's a section called release notes, and you might just find that there's an update to the version of software that you've got. Okay, so this has confused quite a few people, just to sort of set the record straight online, because a lot of people are getting these update warnings in their version 20. If you have version 20 right now, you need to go to the support page and download the new version. So you have to go to the website, the Capture One website, and download the current version, which will give you 20.1.4, which is the Big Sur compatibility release. If you're on version 21, make sure you're running, where are we? Not that version. That version, 21.0.1 or 14.0.1, that will update automatically in your software. So it's a bit confusing when the software company quite rightly is supporting two versions that are still current. So the announcement went out the other day about the version 20 update. If you're on version 21, that update does not apply to you, so don't worry about it. For those of you thinking about version 21, don't forget there's that 20-minute quick guide that we did. So go on to this channel, so the YouTube channel, you'll find in there the section called Pro Tips, and in there is the version 21 guide, which will tell you most of, in fact pretty much all of the changes that are in version 21, and you can make your call from there. Today, let's get started. So this is a picture that Ernst sent in. So everyone's got a Christmas card from Ernst. Hello, Ernst, and thank you. But Ernst also sent in a couple of pictures that we want to have a look at. And it was these ones. So the question that Ernst had on this was, I think you actually called it nuclear grass from memory. So the green grass was just too much. If we want to see the before, let's have a look. So that was our before image, and this is our after image. Now, what's great is all the changes that Ernst has made actually have brought out all this detail, all of this clarity out here. It's got some lovely tones in the background, but, and it's a big but, there's a weird thingy on there I've just seen, but it has done it, unfortunately, to the sacrifice of color fidelity. So let me just get rid of, I thought that was an annotation, but maybe it's not. Weird. Okay, we'll just leave that little dot in there. For some reason it's there. However, what we have got here is an example of where bringing up all of the levels and all of the clarity sliders and everything like that, and HDR sliders, even selectively, does a great job. And you can see all the layers that Ernst has built on here. it does a great job of bringing the image up and lifting it and making it pop. But if you're not careful, you can find that those colors can start to look too enriched, too vibrant, a little bit over the top. So the first thing I did actually in this, because the good thing is Ernst actually sent me the EIP, so I can see every single adjustment, all of these layers that he's created in here. And I thought, maybe he's gone into the color slider and maybe we've done a bit of a green boost. So just looking through here on the background, on the mist layer, no. On the background, yeah, a little bit. So there's a little touch of saturation on the background. So if I were to reset this slider, or this tool, yeah, it does have a small effect. So that's with, and that's without. And then let's look at the middle hill one. Well, again, we've got this hue change on the green, but it's not a massive saturation shift. But again, let's just do it. So before and after. And remember, with every single tool, you don't actually have to fully reset. You can just hold down the Option key or the Alt key on Windows, and this little arrow here, which is normally the reset button, just be warned, if you click it without holding down the key, it will reset the tool completely. If you want to undo it, you still can. You can edit undo. But if you want to do it temporarily, Alt or Option, hold that down on your keyboard, and then press and hold. That's without, and that's with. So again, not in there. There's no green adjustment in our tree's background layer. No adjustment in foreground, no adjustment in any of these other layers at all. It's just maybe that middle hill, and more importantly, this one here. But that's not enough to make this boost and have this massive, great big green pop. So there's no saturation adjustment in here, and this is where I started to fall a little bit sort of concerned, because the only saturation that we've got in here is this middle hill. In terms of the foreground, there's no adjustment here. There are some levels and so on, but there's nothing massively screaming out, let's say, to let us know what's going wrong. Why are these greens so bright? And actually, having done it, and I actually went through layer by layer on each and every layer that's there created by Ernst. This is a classic case of every single one of these little adjustments have all added up. They've compounded to create this sort of over-the-top, slightly oversaturated view. So we've got two choices really when this happens. And this is a general thing. So one of the great things about having layers is obviously we can do the opacity, so we can wind it down and wind it up again. But there is one thing that tends to happen, which is all of those compound effects have a very big effect at the end. It's always worth doing your before and after, just so that you can have a little view of reality of what was captured versus what you've managed to process. Before and after, remember, you press the Y key on the keyboard and it pops up. You can change the view if you want to allow for the different options that you've got, the full view or the split view. So with before and after, that gives us a bit of a view as to what exactly has changed cumulatively. So we can either go through every single layer and dial each one down a little bit, or we can just put a layer over the top that's going to fix the one thing that we've got a problem with. So if I create a new filled adjustment layer, so hold down the button on the plus sign, new filled adjustment layer. So this layer, if I press M on my keyboard to show the mask, you can see it's 100% covered because it's a filled layer. Now with this layer, all I'm going to do actually is what I effectively was looking for in the first place, which is go to my color tab. And we can do it in the simple tab if we want to. And I can choose this picker, and I can click in here, and I can increase or decrease saturation of whatever I've picked by using the mouse. So clicking and hold, going right and left changes the hue of that color that was chosen. Going up and down changes the saturation. And if I hold down the Alt key or the Option key, left and right changes the lightness. So you can see the sliders moving on the left. That was seen as a great speed enhancement when it was launched. Personally, I don't use that very much because it's much better for me to go onto the Advanced tab and select a color here, because this color issue here isn't just green. We're saying it's green because it's a field. So we know that grass is meant to be green. Our brain tells us that's green. So let's change the green. But actually, if I click on this area here, it's not green at all. It's yellow. And this area here, actually, is more sort of reddy orange than green and so on. The only real true green is sort of, well, not even there, maybe out here a little bit. Yeah, we're getting more into green out here. And this bit isn't oversaturated. So let's just let's just delete some of these selections down here. So with my picker, I'm going to choose this area here, and I'm going to tell Capture One I want to capture everything pretty wide actually out there. And I've got an option down here that say View Selected Color Range, which will turn the rest of the image black and white, so I can see only what I have selected. With that, we're just going to pull our saturation down a touch and our lightness. And that's one key thing with this. It's not just saturation. When we increase the lightness of color, it can give the perception of it being vivid and overdone. So if I turn off our View Selected Color Range now, already we've started to calm it down. So I can pull down my saturation a little bit more and pull our lightness down a touch too. Starts to feel a bit more realistic. I'm actually going to bring that saturation back up a bit more and use lightness more out of the two options just to pull it down. So now with that layer, if I turn that layer off, we have our, as Ernst put it, radioactive green or nuclear green, and on we've got then the muted tones and so on. Now beyond that, what I can also do with my color editor is I go to these three dots and I can say create a masked layer from that selection. So we've done this a few times before in other sessions, but this is one of the most powerful bits that you can use in Capture One when it comes to color selections, because what I've got here was my green desaturate, but the new layer it's just created, mask from green and yellow, if I turn my mask on, we can actually see it's chosen exactly those areas. Now, the color editor obviously lets me play with hue, saturation, and lightness for that color that I selected. But now I've converted that color selection into a mask on a different layer. If I go onto this layer, I can now change things like highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, but just for that color range. So this then becomes really, really powerful because the color editor itself only actually lets me change four different options for that color range. But I can take that color range and I can create a brand new layer with that range as a mask, and I can then tweak that mask. So what I can also do, of course, is I can refine that mask. So let's just go on to display, and we can use Capture One's intelligence to soften the edges and make sure it blends quite nicely using refine mask. We could also obviously apply a luma range to it as well. We can feather the edges and so on. But for now, if I take this mask in isolation, let's just prove to you what it's done. Pull down exposure, pull up exposure. I'm only affecting what I chose in that color range. So in this color range, I could actually pull down a little bit of clarity to soften it. And I could pull down a touch of structure, and that reduces some of the sharpening on the very edges. And the effect that's having on this grass here, if I turn off these two layers, that was where we were before. This is with the green desaturated, and that's then with that subtle reduction in clarity and structure. And it's an odd thing to suggest to people, because obviously we always want an image to be sharp. That's what we're looking for. We want a sharp, in focus, crisp, clean, vibrant image most of the time. But if you overdo that in some scenes, this one being a good example, it can start to look unnatural. As Ernst put it, you get the nuclear grass. We get to this stage here. So to me, this then becomes a much more natural looking one on the bottom than where it was before. And the key thing for me, funnily enough, isn't actually this scene. It is possible in certain lighting conditions. Let me just make the crop just to show you. It is possible on a bright summer's day that that's exactly what that field looks like. It is possible that it's reflecting all of those glow and rays from the sun, and you're getting this wonderful, bright, popping green and yellow in that scene. But it's not possible for it to be doing it if the sky was doing this. And this is where you've got to make sure that the join between the atmosphere and the foreground makes sense to the viewer. So it's absolutely possible that this was the case. And actually in this case, if I were to go to my background, we could even, if we wanted to, let me just clone this actually so I don't completely screw up any changes. We could even warm up that light to be a nice summery light with a little tint. We can make this scene into any feel that we want, but I can't do that if it's disjointed then from the rest of the atmosphere in the scene. So you've got, let's go back to our original scene. So one of the questions JD's just put up there, it looks like there was a bright sky above the clouds. There was a bright sky above the clouds, but if I go back to the original JD, so let's have a look at this, it wasn't hitting these hills, so that sunlight wasn't quite getting there. And this then feels more correct versus this. So if that was the natural scene, yes, there is more light getting here than there was in the hills, but there wasn't that much light. And this just starts to feel a little bit disconnected from the atmosphere in the scene. So if I then put these layers back on, we've just toned it down, and literally to make it match the mood that's meant to be up there. Yeah, so yeah, so didn't see the original till now. Genuinely, and I sort of said it earlier, genuinely, one of the tricks that I tend to use with everyone actually, but even on my own images, make all the changes you want, but do them on layers. And the reason for doing that is if I make a change and then at the end, and this is a process that we should all go through, at the end, just do that before and after each time. Just do a little, how far have I come? And some of it is to make sure that your edits are good and progressive and they've made a positive difference, because sometimes you can get down a rabbit hole and make a negative one. But there is a case where you look at it before and after and think, I need to dial a few things back. And if I dial a few things back, I don't want to have to go into every single tool to do it and hunt and search for what it was. It's much easier for me to do it layer by layer and say, well, okay, this layer actually I want to pull back to only 80% of its impact. This one, 50%, and so on. Now, if you don't do that, or like in this case, I can't hunt well enough to find out exactly what the individual changes were to make that big effect. But if that is the case, there is nothing stopping you doing just what I did, which is create a new filled layer on the top. And then with that filled layer, just use that layer to mute things down. And in the case of a color change, number one, with our, as we just did with our color editor here, we can use that to select a range of color and make the changes just to that color range, even though I've got everything selected. And then if I want to go really advanced, we can then take that layer, go to these three dots, create a masked layer from selection. That creates you a brand new layer with that color selection as a mask. Make sure you refine it or feather it so that it blends in quite nicely as well. And then use that mask to give you access to all of the other tools, like clarity, that you wouldn't get with the color editor too. Okay, where are we? Ernst, yeah, no, there was no sun. Yeah, I figured that one. And actually, if we look at the original image, genuinely, Ernst, I know you're concerned that the original one, as you put it, was a little nuclear. Genuinely, the editing in this is really good. When I look out here with these layers that you put in for the clarity out in the background and so on, it's a really nice edit of actually quite a difficult scene. And funnily enough, you haven't even touched the dehaze slider. You've done it manually, and actually, in my opinion, it's worked out better for it. The nuclear grass is just a byproduct of all the little tweaks that you made. Adding them up together, it ends up getting a little bit out of control. It's a quick fix, as you just seen. We just put a layer over the top and then mute those issues down. JD, didn't get to ask last week. Still using a Mac Pro with these, or moved to an M1 Mac. So I haven't moved to an M1. In part, the reason is there are a couple of issues with it. So number one, the Mac Pro that we've got is it's a beast. Even by M1 standards, it's still a beast. And for things that are multi-threaded and multitask, so for instance, right now we are editing Capture One images, in some cases 150 megapixel images. If you remember a couple of weeks ago, well, 2 weeks ago, we did a focus stack with 150 megapixel images times 10 and whatever, processing it. While this is managing a 4K input of video, while managing the H.264 transcoding, while it's sending it to YouTube and to Facebook and so on, and saving it locally and whatever, and managing things like the commenting system, the M1 Macs are insanely fast when you hit it with a task that you want to do in the foreground. When it's challenged with lots and lots of background tasks, and that unified memory is starting to get eaten up by your foreground, it can potentially be a bit of a challenge. Now, I'm a massive fan of what they've done with M1. And I think when you start to get into the next series of M1 chips, so when you get into the more higher end specs, there's going to be some exciting changes that happen. And at that point, we'll probably make a bit of a jump. But for now, it's still Mac Pro for this. Okay, so that's Ernst's image on top of his Christmas card. So happy Christmas, Ernst. And then we've got a couple from Claudio. I'm going to go through 2 on this one. We're not going to touch this one, Claudio, because I think we could make it into something exciting, but I have a feeling that when you shot that wasn't the weather you were hoping for. So we're gonna have a look at the other 2 images as well. So let's have a little look at this shot. One of your concerns that you had was actually all the fog and everything and mist had made it look a little bit unclear, and maybe it's introduced some noise. Honestly, I think given the scene, I don't have a problem with it, and this is a lovely shot. It's a really nice shot. So let's make a couple of small tweaks that might help, but there's really not a lot that I'm going to try and do with this one. So the first tweak is if we do want the animal to stand out from the rest of the background, and this goes for any scenario like this, any wildlife shot. First off, let's create a layer. Is that a stag or a deer? What is the difference? I'm going to call it a stag deer, just in case I get it wrong. So with our stag deer, I'm going to paint a really, and I'm showing you this with the brush sliders. We could, of course, use the Control and Option keys to make changes to our brush, but so that you can see what I'm doing, we right-click on the image and I can change my brush settings. So really soft brush, quite low opacity, not that big. I'm going to leave my flow up at 100 for this case, and I'm going to put a bit of a mask. Don't worry, you're not seeing things. There's no mask there at the moment because I haven't pressed the M button. So what I'm also going to do is give myself an eraser. Now, the temptation with Capture One that everyone does is to link all their brushes. But if you link your brush, if I'm using a smooth, soft, not very opaque brush, but I want 100% eraser, then unfortunately I don't want to link those brushes. So don't have them linked if you're going to work like this. So for me, I'm just going to erase that bit that I did wrong and then go back to my brush, which is still the soft setting it was before. It's not at 100% like the other one was. And we're going to just paint in a bit more. So because I'm using opacity rather than flow, it means that as I click and hold, it's never ever going to increase the amount. No matter how many times I go over an area, it's always going to stop and top out at that sort of 20% that I dialed in. I'm not worried about the legs, and for those of you that have been on here for a while, you're going to know why. I'm not too worried about the antlers right now, but we'll have maybe a play with that in a second. So first thing with this one, lumen range. And I'm going to get rid of this snow. So that's a mask that I've drawn really, really quite poorly. Well, it's not a problem because I'm just going to dial back my lumen range until we get rid of all of the stuff that's not the animal. And the further I tail that off, the softer that fall off becomes. And let's put a bit of radius on there to soften the edges. And if it still doesn't get anything that I want to get rid of, go to my eraser tool, and of course we can still erase those bits. So that's the body. Now what about the horns? Well, to be honest, we're going to do that slightly differently with a different layer. Let's just turn off our mask. So with this layer, if I just use that clarity slider, up comes the, is it a stag or is it a deer? Help. Anyway, so up comes the detail throughout all the fur. We could increase a little bit of structure just to make it pop a little bit. And of course we could, let me just pull down, I think it's in the shadows, yeah. So this area here is in this shadow area on our histogram. So there's nothing stopping me pulling down those shadows a bit just to get a bit more definition against the background. Remember, that shadow slider, even if I hadn't masked it, it's not going to pick up any of this snow and frost and everything because it's not within the shadows area in the histogram. All of this stuff here sits in the midtones and the highlights. And Simon's just really confused things with it. Could be a moose. Is it? No, it's too. Yeah, it's too pointy. We'll go with stag deer. So with that change done, let's have a look at these antlers up here, because what I want to do to a certain extent is We could, if we really wanted to, do a fully intricate mask and so on. The problem that I have with it is I don't want these antlers to stand out too much. So let's just add a new layer called antlers. And with a really small brush, I'm just going to push that opacity up quite a bit. And with a really small brush, we are going to just brush this in here. And I'm a bit worried about using things like luma masks on here, because if you actually have a look at, in fact, we're going to go to 100%. It's just going to make life easier. If we have a look at these edges, they're actually very similar luma range in terms of brightness to the background. So you're not going to be able to separate them out really. But what we can do, and this is where clarity is wonderful. Let me just do this up here as well. Bear with. We could do an auto mask and spend a lot of time cutting out around it. I did try it earlier, and unfortunately, because it doesn't quite see the brightness difference, it also doesn't quite see the value in trying to cut out the antlers for us, which is a bit annoying. But I'm not too worried. I can be really quite rough with this because I'm only trying to capture basically the middle part of the antlers. I'm not too worried about catching the rest of it. So now I've got rid of all the tricky bits. We're just going to do, again, it's a really rough mask. Don't worry about getting this too accurate. There's our mask there. And all the way up to that one. Now remember, this is at 100%, so it doesn't matter how many times I go over it, it's not going to change. It's all a solid mask. And then we're just going to do a slight little blend into here. So I'm just using a couple of opacity layers just to softly blend it down here. And you can see how rough this mask is. Do not worry. So let's just get rid of that there. Okay. So with our mask now set, I can use our clarity tool just to pop it. Now, if we do it too much, it's going to get a little bit out of hand. But just remember, you saw how bad that mask was just then that I drew. Now, with our clarity, let's just turn that off so you can see it, and on. And all I'm looking for is, do we have any halos? And actually we do. I can see one just here. So let me turn my mask back on again, and we can see why, because I went over the edge. But you've just seen how rough that mask is. It's not very neat at all. But because I'm using clarity, and clarity is only looking at areas that change contrast, I'm not going to have any issues with that rough mask. So let's just turn that off again. Without, soft and lost in the mist, and then back in, and we're all good. So immediately then, with no other change, we've got a much clearer stag slash deer slash moose slash stag deer. Okay, finally then, and it's sort of a finally, what I want to do actually is just warm this up a little bit. So I'm going to add in a touch more warmth in there. I know it's meant to be a wintry scene. The temptation with a wintry scene is to make things blue. But I'm also in a place where it would be nice to see this nice warm sort of daylight or morning light coming through. Let's get rid of that green tint a little bit. We've still got the cold frost. We've still got the slightly blue tint in this cold frost. But that warmth just adds a little bit more, I guess, softness to that shot. Now, the problem is, as some of you will have noticed, I did that on the wrong layer because we've only done it on the one that I drew the mask. So let's just undo that and do it on our background layer like I was meaning to, which is going to affect the whole lot, which is a much better effect. There we go. Okay, I was wondering why nothing down here was changing at all. So again, a bit of a gotcha. Be careful of when you flip from one layer to another and you think, oh, okay, I just want to change the white balance. Remember to come off of the layer that you've got the mask on, because it's only going to change the white balance on that mask. And we've got another one now from Barry, which is elk. So now, yeah, now we're out of control. It's a stag, deer, elk, moose. Sorry to the nature lovers out there. That's what I'm going with. Okay. Now, there's one little tweak that we make at the end of this, and it's simply, I'm not going to use the vignette to do it. I am going to use a radial mask because I don't want the whole scene to be centered around the exact middle of the scene. I want it to be centered around the animal thing, deer, stag. So, new layer. We're going to call it vignette, even though it's not using the vignette tool. So remember, the vignette tool takes the corners and brings it in directly to the center. It can be elliptical or it can be square, but it's still going to be central. The second we go into a mode of drawing a nice, soft mask in there, a radial mask. So let's just turn on our mask so we can see it. And once again, as I think Claudio's just said, Capture One again doesn't like your Olympus files. There is something odd with these files, Claudio. We're going to have a little play with it at some point because the mask doesn't immediately come on. Okay, with that mask done, we can, however, let's just randomly doesn't turn off. Let's just pull down our exposure. And again, what we don't want to do is completely fake it. That looks ridiculous. But it's just to darken it down. Now, the more I look at it, I'm thinking, actually, we could get away with more of a distinctive fall off. So traditionally, we'd always have it as quite a soft fall off so you don't notice. I don't have a problem with this bit getting darker around here, and it starts to match the feel of the focus as well, because the focus is on the animal, not on anything else around the edges. So we'll pull down our exposure a little bit, and I'm going to pull our shadows using the levels tool to be even darker. So that where it is dark, we're going to stretch those shadows even further, but only on the mask that I've created, only on the radial mask that's here. And Nick has added in, it could also be a giant horned rabbit. However, the person who shot it, here we go, is the ultimate answer. It's a red deer. A Cervus or Curvus? Elaphus. Okay. We'll go with that one. That seems to be the official one. So, although now we've just also got elk too. Right. So, that overall was a set of very small adjustments. If you think about it, we added a bit of clarity and we lowered some shadow on the body. We added quite a bit of clarity on the horns on a very distinctive mask. And then we added a manual vignette onto it. Very small changes. But again, this is the whole point. When you look at these changes here, let's just get rid of this gradient tool, and I compare before and after, it adds a whole different feel and a whole different mood to that shot. And more importantly, we've got rid of some of the murkiness and mistiness that you were worried about, Claudio, in the body here and the fur. Be careful not to push it too far. The temptation would be, okay, well, I've got that with that. Maybe we push a bit more structure, a bit more clarity. I think it's going to push it too far. It's just going to get a little bit out of hand. And you can see in here some artifacts start to appear. That's through over sharpening, so don't push the structure too much and try and keep clarity under control. You don't want to get it pushed too far. Clive's on a place it could be a new, and we're going to stick, I think, with Serge's answer, which is a four-legged thing. We'll go with that. So Slobodan's just asked an interesting question, actually. What about using dehaze on the picture? So this then goes back to the root of one of my big challenges with dehaze, and I think it's something that's going to happen. We're going to go through this little spell of dehaze in general. It's a bit like when the HDR craze sort of cottoned on. Now we have it. We're gonna stick with it. So now we have a dehaze tool. Let's use it. And my worry with this shot, and we'll do it. Let's just fill. I'm going to fill that layer, and what do we call it? Dehaze. So with this layer, we've got the whole lot masked. Let's pull our haze. Now, it's now a lot clearer for sure, but I'm not sure I like it at all. I think it's now just way too pushed. It's just too clear, and more importantly, we've lost the atmosphere. So to me, there are a couple of interesting uses that we could have with dehaze. The first use is we could potentially use it on our stag, deer, elk, moose. We could just pull a bit of dehaze on there. Just be careful again not to overdo it. This now looks composited. It looks fake because it doesn't match the atmosphere for the overall shot. So a little bit of that may help us. Again, on the antlers, we could do a touch of that. I haven't had to choose a new shadow tone, which is good. Now, if I go to the dehaze layer, what I am tempted to do is to rehaze it, so unhaze, as it were, or undehaze. Now, what that means is, let's just do off and on. I've got a layer now with a load of haze on it. If I undo or clear this mask, so there's nothing selected, and I go to my brush tool. So with my brush tool, I could choose, in this case, the Grover method of 100% opacity. Let's do a relatively soft area here and a really, really, really low flow. So if I start drawing up here with my mask, I could, if I want to, introduce some extra haze. And you've got to be careful because we don't want to undo too much of what we've already done with it. But let's just have a look. Let's turn the mask off. So that's without the haze. That's with added haze. So without, with added. And we can keep adding if we want to, and we can add some atmosphere. So, funnily enough, Mr. Grover is online. There we go. So just because you can doesn't mean you should. Absolutely. So to me, it's a case of dehaze is a challenge on this shot. If I use it to reduce the haze, I lose the atmosphere of the whole shot. And it's in fog. That's the great part of this shot. If I use it to add haze or rehaze, so negative dehaze, like I've just done there, of course I can, I can keep painting in extra fog and whatever. But now I'm less photoing and more painting, in my view. Debate point there, but yeah, that's the bit of a challenge of it. So to me, just be careful that you don't overdo it. Absolutely, the dehaze tool is fantastic for certain aspects. And for example, if we go back to Ernst's shot earlier, where are we? This one, this was all done manually by Ernst, and it's a great job of it. And the dehaze tool will also do a good job out there. But that's because we want to get rid of specifically some of the murkiness that's appeared through the weather. When the shot is all about that atmosphere, it doesn't feel right to then get rid of it. If anything, we could add it on. Okay, so let's move from that shot. But again, as I say, really small changes, but it's just about changing the feel of it and that light just being a bit more golden. And I get it, Claudio, the idea of trying to get more detail in the stag, deer, moose, elk thing. There we go. So let's move on to your next shot, which is this one. So I believe Santorini. If I'm wrong, then I've been looking at the wrong picture for a long time. Let's have a little play with what we can do with this. The first thing I want to do, obviously, is get rid of this stuff down in the foreground. And my gut feel is let's just do it on a 1x2, a nice panoramic crop. And let's make sure we're not cutting anything off in this corner up here. That looks pretty good there. Let's just set that on there. Great. We have got a couple of things. There's some people down here. Where is it? People, I think. Yeah, some people down there. So we want to draw the attention away from that. The moon actually has come out pretty nicely. It's still quite sharp. It's still a little bit of a point out in the distance, but it's in the shot. And we've got this motion of the boat. So what are we going to do with it? Well, actually, let's just do a little play. Let's just dehaze it now. Going back to our previous discussion about when to use and when not to use, well, this is actually a good example of if you want to get some clarity back into these buildings. This isn't necessarily haze out here, but the dehaze tool is going to do a lot of the work for us without us having to play with levels and curves and all the other stuff. So again, be careful not to overdo it. Be careful to choose the right shadow tone for the dehaze tool so it doesn't shift your colors too much. You've got the wrong shadow tone if you see your colors shift. So if I choose with the dehaze tool this tone, let's just put a decent amount of dehaze in. So if I chose this color here, I'm going to get a very different result to this color and a very different result to out here. So make sure your shadow tone is a neutral color that is affected by the haze, and you'll get a much more natural result. So I'm just going to choose, I think, out there. Oh, no, definitely not that one. It's probably more this gray brick here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so with that done, let's have a look about what we're going to do with the sky. So first off, let's draw a new gradient mask. Now remember in Capture One, if I haven't got any other layers and I start drawing a gradient, either radial or a linear one, the first thing it's going to do is create that new layer there called Adjustment Layer 1. Let's call that one Sky. And with this, we're just going to pull down our exposure. We're not going to get rid of this completely. It's going to be mad if we try and do that. In fact, if we did that, it just doesn't really work. We want to leave some in there. So I might pull this down a bit here. And we might also just pull shadows a touch there down. Now remember, those two elements, So I'm bringing down the entire exposure of that red area, and I'm picking on the shadows of that red area and also bringing them down, but only in the red area. And that's really important because in order to lift this image, I'm going to create a new layer called foreground. We're still on the it can't be a stag party. No, unfortunately it's solo. And Brian, moose bites can be pretty nasty. Yeah. Oh my god, I hate these sessions where I have to go and do some research afterwards because I'm now worried that I've got the wrong animal. So with our foreground, let's just make sure we've got our display mask on. So we've got never display mask at the moment. Press M on the keyboard and you get the always display mask option. So M toggles mask on and off. When you're drawing a gradient, it's useful to have it on for obvious reasons. So let's just go to about there. In fact, let's just make that angle up here so I'm getting this top corner in too. Remember, the distance of those three lines dictates how soft the mask fall off is. And by fall off, we mean how easy or how slowly it goes from 100% masked, which is this line and below, to 50% masked, which is this line here, to 100% masked there. And of course, with Capture One, if I want to make these masks asymmetrical, if I hold down the Alt or the Option key and grab either side of the line, rather than moving them together, which is what the default is, like that, if I hold down that Option key, I can change one edge or the other. So I can have a softer fall off into the sky if I choose, and maybe a harder fall off up into these buildings. Okay. So there's our mask. With that mask, we're going to lift the shadows so I can see a bit more of what's going on in the buildings. So again, remember, this is about the selective changes on an area of the image, because if I'd lifted the shadows on the whole image, we saw the effect that dumbing the shadows down up here had. That's going to lift all of that stuff in the sky up as well that we're trying to get rid of. So let's have a little think about what we're trying to do to each independent part of the image and make that change. So for example, up in the top of the sky now, well, actually I could cool this down quite a bit into a more of a night sky. We could also increase a bit of contrast just to get some deeper colors out here. In the foreground, well, we've now got a decision. We can warm up the foreground a little bit. Again, not too much. Don't push it too much. We can shift away from some of that green tint, not too much again. In fact, let's just go there. And I'm almost tempted on this one to push the saturation down a little bit too. Yeah, that sort of works in my head. Of course, we can use a little bit of clarity in our foreground. And maybe a little bit of structure just to make sure that we've got all these textures up. So, where are we? I just saw a question come up. Is the picture tilted to the left? You know, that's a good question. It's a tough one because I can't see the horizon that clearly. We've got the island out there. Let's just go back to our background quickly. Let's see if we can get a horizon. No, not quite. One of the measures may be around the angle of the verticals, and I can see there is a little bit of a lean there. So it may be. Let's just use our straightening tool to try and force that. So I'm just going to try and dial that down there. Maybe that's better. Hugh, let me know if that's better for your eyes. If it is, then we're all good. So yeah, in general, I think that's pretty straight now. It was a little bit leaning beforehand, so if we're all comfortable with that, then we're all good. Right. Now, that's had all of those changes done to it, as well as an overall dehaze on the image. So let's do our undo of the dehaze and redo of that dehaze. You see that difference that made? So here's again my undo and the redo. Now, to me, that saved me a couple of extra clicks. So it saved me some of the curve adjustments and the levels adjustments and stuff like that. But it has come at a slight price, which is I've lost some of the softer tones in the building. So I'm just going to pull this back a touch there, just because I don't want to lose that completely. We don't want it looking too crisp. Now, there is one final thing on this shot, which, although we've got this sky change, which overall brings down the sky, those of you that have been following me for a while know that I have one big bugbear, which is when things get brighter towards the edge of a print. So even though this has fixed this sky to a huge extent, I'm actually in a place where I want to fix it a bit more. So I'm going to create a new layer at the top and just say top sky. And with this now, of course, we've got our crop sorted out. I'm just going to draw a completely, in fact, no, I'm not going to do it completely straight because I don't want to hit this building on the right too much. But with that, I am going to pull down the overall exposure on that top. And you see the difference? If I'd done that on the big sky layer, then we'd be pulling down all of this stuff. So it would have also pulled down the moon. It would have pulled down too much of this building. If we don't like what that's done on the building, I can rasterize this mask. So it stops being a gradient and starts being a paintable area. And if I choose my eraser, and let's go for a very, very, very soft change up here. I'm going to do a few clicks just so that we're feathering it in a bit. That's nice there. I'll turn that mask off. And to me, this just feels a bit better when we don't have that brightness getting bigger and bolder and brighter as it gets to the edge of the print, especially when you frame it. And back to the back to the deer thing. Mr. Grover says it's a deer, so we're not going to agree to that one. But where was it? Claudio said it's a red deer, so we'll go with that one. We've got the Latin name, so that counts for everything. Although it's a male red deer, i.e. a stag. And to add into the mix, Brian, we're back on the it's called a buck. So that's our second shot of Claudio's. Now, if I go again, before and after, and this is really important, we've made quite a few little changes in this. Not a lot, but they are little changes. Oh, sorry, one thing I did forget. In this foreground, silly me. In this foreground, there's another change I want to do. Let's go to our foreground. I'm going to pull back the whites and the highlights by quite a lot too. Because, let me just undo this so you can see. That's before, that's after. Now, we don't want this to be pushed too much, so I'm actually going to dial them back a bit because I don't want it looking too cartoony. But it does mean that we get some of those highlights back, some of these blowouts on these walls and stuff like that. We can get to see some of the detail back if we want to. If we don't, of course, we can reset those sliders. Don't push them too far. Don't push your shadows up and blacks up and then whites down and highlights down. You'll end up with a cartoon, as we talk about quite a lot. But a little bit of those goes a long way to getting rid of some of the overblown highlights, especially when light is hitting concrete walls. Now, before and after, all small changes. We go from there to there. We go from here, which is it is a perfectly good scene. There's nothing wrong with this shot for the conditions that were there. All that we've done is just made it feel a bit more like a night scene. That's all. And if I want to add a bit more of this tail off on the top, all I'm going to do is just add in another set of, on my top sky. Add in a few more darker bits up here. Oops, that's probably a bit too bold, so too much opacity. And with each click, I'm just feathering in a bit more darkness, just so we don't see any line as that's fading out. So there we go. Now, again, your choice. To a lot of people, they may prefer the first one. The light bouncing back off of the moisture in the air looks really nice. But if I really wanted to bring out the fact that these are the shots about the buildings and the structure into the hillside, then maybe this is a better option. This thing here, this area here, I do want to lift. I've just seen that. So I'm just going to create a new layer called buildings. And with my brush, all I'm going to do, let's just pull that opacity up, is I'm moving the mouse over here to see where this stuff sits. It's all in the mid-tone, so bringing up the shadows isn't going to help me. But I am going to bring up brightness. And as I paint over here, we just bring the brightness of those buildings up a little bit. And with that nice soft edge and not much opacity now on the second wave, I can feather that in so you don't notice I've done it. So me using opacity and flow in the cases of when it's used, this is all about making sure that the change is really subtle when you see it. So you don't see just a line and a blob over all this stuff. It's actually a really, really soft feathered edged adjustment, which means I go from there without to therewith. And if I go over any other bits, well, let's just use your eraser. Just go up to 100% if you need to, and let's just chop that out if we want. Okay, so that's where we get to with that. So Claudio's 2 images. So this one we go from there to there, really subtle, but it brings out all the details and texture and warms it up. This shot here, we go from, you know, it's a nice shot, but this just feels a bit more like a nighttime shot of that scene. And let's go on to Francesco's shot. So in this shot, this actually has used, I believe, one of the, was it this one here? Yeah, so you've used one of the styles, Francesco, which is the autumn style. If I go on before and after, this style has a sort of, you know, the, let's call it the cross-processed or Instagram-y effect that occurs when you start to do a lot of color balance changes and split toning. It's a really nice style that's been added onto this shot. And these two, you know, I think this one's been recovered really nicely in the foreground, all this detail and stuff in here. There's not much I would change with it. But the question that you had was about these rock formation shots. And the challenge, I think, that you'd mentioned was, do they look a little bit overworked? And my answer is yeah, they do. There we go. So Francesco is the style created personally. It's a nice style. It's done well. And as I say, in the right scene, it's got a really nice sort of feel to it. It's got a cream feel into all of those highlights, and brings out all the reds and so on in the tree. So it's a nice style for this. So what about these? Well, when I looked at all the layers, there's a lot of work that's gone into these shots for sure. So if I turn my masks on, we've got a sharpness mask, which is specific over certain rocks. We've got a burn mask. We've got a dodge mask for certain areas as well. We've got that overall style that Francesco's created. And we've got a curve introduced in here, although I couldn't see much of a change. It's just in the luma there. And then the background has got some little tweaks on HDR. And it's there that I think we have the challenge, because if I go back to our before image, specifically, let's look around this area here, and let's look around this area up here on the rocks. For want of a better phrase, and I'm trying not to use this phrase all the time, but this starts to feel like a line drawing almost towards cartoon. And on this one here, when I looked at the dodge and burn layers, you know, you've got a burn layer in here, which is quite heavy in here and then fades out. You've got a dodge layer that affects out here. And the cumulative effect of it is you've got this strange thing where the rock isn't quite even, if you see what I mean. It gets darker as it gets towards the edge, and lighter as it gets in towards the middle. And it's where, and let's just zoom into here, you can see. Where the mask is, we've got this lightness here, but then it gets darker here. And it doesn't make sense because it's a flat rock. So I sort of struggle with it a little bit in the way that those changes have been applied specifically in certain areas. So let's just go back to a new variant. So brand new, with no changes on it at all. And this is kind of where you wanted to get to in terms of feel. What I'm not going to do, Francesco, is apply that style that you had, so the colouring may be a little bit different in what we're going to do. But I think you can do most of what you're trying to do on literally the flat image. I don't think you necessarily need all of that work in the masking. So let's just have a look. If we want to do some changes to the rocks, well, let's just paint very quickly a full mask, pretty much. Oops, turn my mask on so we can see. All over here. Wonderful. Luma range. And let's discount all of that bright sky. So let's just move that over there. Nice fall off, but not so that we're picking up any of the cloud. I'm happy that this is falling off on that right hand side. So we're getting a bit of feathering up there. Let's just soften that radius on the edges a little bit. In fact, not too much because we're on a rock edge. The reason for me saying that is I don't want to soften out the edges here where there is a sharp edge out on that outside. So I've now got a mask which is basically all of my foreground elements. And those foreground elements I can now pull up some clarity on, but I can also pull up some shadow if I want. And maybe add in an extra touch of contrast, which is that sort of brutal, take the histogram down the middle and force it brighter or darker. But overall, just pull our brightness up a touch. That gives me a much clearer view of the rock, but it's still even. It's still evenly illuminated, as opposed to these areas here, which seem to be a bit pushed. For the sky, well, we can do exactly the same, effectively. So I can either invert the mask, but in this case, let's just do a foreground name. And let's create a new layer called sky. And with that layer, I'm just going to draw a gradient over there. Pull this down, and we're just going to do the opposite. So I'm going to go into my Luma range, and in this case, I'm going to exclude anything that is dark and rocky, basically. And if it doesn't get all of it, don't be too worried about it, because we can always go in and erase if we need to. The important part is making sure that we've got all of that sky. So a little bit of radius on there and apply. Now, if I click on here and go to show grayscale mask, that's going to help me when I go to my eraser. We're still getting that weird issue with masks. When I zoom in, it's going to appear. There we go. It's almost predictable, that little bug. So with our opacity set to 100%, size up a little bit. If I really want to get rid of some of this mask, I can now go in, having done the Luma range to get rid of the edge stuff. Well, we can just go in here and softly get rid of the detail that's in the rock. Okay, there may be a little bit of overlap on the top. We'll keep an eye on that to make sure we don't get any halos. And let's turn our mask off. And with this up here, well, what we can do is we can put in a nice little punch of clarity. And in fact, this sky's got a lot of movement in it, so we can really punch that pretty well. If we wanted to, we could put in a bit of structure, but there's not really much texture up there, so it's not really going to help with anything. What might help a little bit is to pull some levels in, just a touch there. And I'm going to pull back our whites just a bit too. Now that's calmed down the sky, so what about the foreground? Well, what we can do with our foreground now, and again, the foreground, remember, is only this area. So anything I do in this panel here is going to only apply to that area. So let's pull up our levels here, let's pull up our shadows here. And what we're doing is we're building in extra contrast. And if I want to really increase some of the density of it, or maybe even brighten it a bit, we can do it with our levels tool. But we haven't had to do all the dodging and burning necessarily. It's just done it with an overall adjustment. So if I go to our before and after, we end up in not a bad place, apart from these rocks out here that I'm not very happy with. If I go to the original here, these just seem so much more natural on the left than this flattened version on the right. And it's where we've stretched stuff a bit too much. So all we're going to do, remember on sky we don't have our rocks included. On the foreground we do. So all we're going to do is go to our eraser. And I'm going to choose probably not quite 100% of opacity, just in case I want to feather something in. And I'm just going to remove those pushes that I made for the rocks from these background rocks here, and also from these out here. So all of the changes and all of the stretching of histograms and information and everything is only happening on the bits that we've now got here identified in the front. And again, with all of these, if I want to pull down the impact that layer is having to nothing, back up to 100 we can. Same with the sky, back down, back up to 100 we can. But if I now look at before and after, what we've got is a lifted rock. It's still, in my eyes, a little bit cartoony, but it's sort of doable. I might just back that foreground off a little bit. Versus where we were here, which it just feels pushed and forced a little bit too much for my eyes. Of course, it's going to be personal choice, but I think when I look into here, let's just zoom in at the same time on them. This one on the left is just so sharp, so crisp, and so vivid, let's call it that. To me, I think it's pushing it a little bit beyond what it's capable of doing naturally. David's just made a recommendation. Might be a nice black and white. It's fair call. So let's just do we do a black and white conversion, or do we do it through styles? Let me create a clone of this variant. I'm going to go into a style, and I'm going to use one of the digital back styles from the phase 1 digital back. I'm going to go to this. Oh, I've done it on both of them. That was silly. So let's go on to this one. Let's just clone that variant. And with this one on its own, I'm going to go to black and white neutral. Why? Because black and white contrast can push things a bit too far. Black and white neutral tends to be a bit more forgiving. What I can do though now is go onto the background, and because that neutrality of the black and white conversion, I can push clarity and I can push my contrast a lot higher on the overall image to have a play. So there's the black and white version. It's not bad. I think the colours make it sort of quite impressive in terms of the way it stands out, but black and white could work. We could make it even more contrast if we wanted to with the black and white. We could actually use our normal contrast tool if we want to get some real contrast and real starkness about it. But to me, this also works. Compared to where we were, I just think this feels more natural. And if I do the before and after, I don't have a problem with how much that's been pushed because it's still got the natural tones of the rock. On this shot here, it just feels a bit overdone in these parts. It just starts to feel a bit more like a drawing than it does a photograph. Okay, so I think that's it for today's session, guys. So next week, I'm going to try and work out exactly what we do in terms of timing. It may be that we do a Wednesday again instead of a Thursday, but I'll put that into the Facebook group, which reminds me, that Facebook group, we will discuss predominantly what day you want to do the editing next week. But there's also a load of other stuff that goes on in there. So things like updates and features and people's wishes, what we could do with Capture One, and some of the questions that come up. So have a look in there. Of course, remember you've still got access to see what's in version 21. If you don't have Capture One at all, then remember you can download a free trial for 30 days and use it at your will. For those of you that have version 20, please remember to do that update. It's probably one of the last updates that come for version 20. And if you've got version 21, make sure you're on the latest one. Remember to send in your pictures for next time. Send it on to the sorry, I lost my word. Send it on to the WeTransfer app. So boreforlive.wetransfer.com. Send those in. Send in the raw file, but also don't forget to include your name. And if you've got the EIP, then send that in too, so we can see what you've actually done and see what we can help with. And in the meantime, between now and next time, we will catch you in about a week. But have a happy break / holiday / downtime, whatever it is that you're doing next week, and we will see you nearer to 2021. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.